All right, you've had a long day, and I know that a number of you are feeling just a little bit, And so, what a lot of folks would do in this situation is they would come and they would get some speaker, but because you're a little wore out and tired from listening to Steve earlier, they'd get somebody who would just affirm you. And they would make you feel good about yourself, and they would come in and you'd get a good pat on the head and a rub on the belly. Yeah, but we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. Mostly because something about growing up in Kansas, Kurt, just makes a man angry. And so every once in a while, you got to break somebody out so he can come in and maybe talk to us all. And so you all know who this man is, and so I really don't need to introduce him, but it is seriously an honor and a privilege. Dr. Matt Spangler, B Specialist Professor, University of Nebraska, and I would lay money, everybody in this room already knew that. Probably the thing that's most impressive, and I was mentioning it to somebody in the hallway, so I'm not even blowing smoke at you, I genuinely mean this. I'm not sure of somebody who works in his genre, if there's anybody who does a more masterful job of telling the story in a way that you and I can appreciate, and as a common mortal I can understand. And on occasion, Fred, he'll just rub my nose in it a little bit. And something about that I kind of like. With no further ado, Dr. Spangler.
So before you start, Dr. Spangler, I want to say something. And part of this is out of guilt, because so Matt Spangler he did make it into the book, but there's a section that really left out the contribution he made to getting Bolt across the finish line. And typically, and Matt and I have known each other for a long time, so normally I'd say something very sarcastic in reference to him, but this time this is really heartfelt. Matt Spangler had a tremendous amount to do with getting Bolt over the finish line. About 18 months ago, he agreed to come on board, and he, not only did he bring an extra perspective, an additional perspective, and remember, we were doing things there was no manual for. There's no manual for what was going on. So he brought this extra level of perspective, and the other thing he brought, and Bruce went to it, is he organized us. He made sure when we had our weekly meetings, and even as we went to 2 meetings a week, that we were on target and we had an agenda and we knew what was going on and we got the job done. And Matt Spangler is the reason for that. The other thing is, Matt Spangler has a distinction of being the only one I have ever negotiated a contract with where the guy I was negotiating with said, "That's okay, I'll take less money." He actually did that. I couldn't believe it. Of course, part of that is he knows how cheap I am, and he knew how I was just squirming, so he gave in. Anyway, with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
All right, thank you very much for those extremely kind introductions. I fear the bar has been set maybe a bit too high. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here at really what is a historic event. And Wade, I appreciate the opportunity to have been engaged over the past 18 months and continue my engagement to help get IGS partners across the finish line. It's an experience I have no doubt that I'll enjoy in retrospect. I wondered why one of the more senior speakers of today got to go first thing this morning, and one of the junior speakers had to go at the end of the day. But then I looked at my watch and I realized it's only about half an hour from John Pollock's bedtime, Dave. So that was, I don't think he's in here to defend himself. So what Jackie, I believe, charged me with was to talk about ways that as beef producers, seed stock producers, we can be engaged in national cattle evaluation. As we talked about with Lauren and Bruce about a week ago, perhaps NCE is an outdated term. It's genetic evaluation that takes on an international perspective now, but it's very much a two-way street. this system of equations has been shown to you guys multiple times across multiple meetings, but as I sat in the back of the room today and in all sincerity really enjoyed the initial presentations, I thought, have I ever really done a good job of explaining to you how you're engaged in every bit of this system of equations that actually end up generating the EPDs that hopefully you utilize for sire selection? And I certainly have not. And so this framework that John did a really nice job this morning talking about the history of the best linear unbiased prediction set of equations here that we've used for decades in some form or fashion. Every time you see an X, think about the quality of your contemporary grouping. How well are you really contemporary grouping animals together? It can also be things with quality of measurement of date of birth. That sounds silly to say. Some of you are maybe snickering a little bit, but right age of the animal impacts that as well. So every time you see an X, think of that. Every time you see a Z, think, how well did I identify the animals that I actually measured? Was animal 1's birth weight really animal 2's birth weight? Did I somehow mix that up? Okay, that impacts the Z's. The K, how well did I measure pedigree? Every time you make a pedigree, that's where the air flows in. Every time you see a Y, how well did I actually measure the trait? Did I guess it, or did I actually get out a scale? The alpha, really related to the quality, the quantity of data you turn in. So my point is although this is a system of equations animal breeders use, it's the quality of your data, the quality of your recording that makes it work. So it's very much a two-way street. So my overall thesis is that cooperative genetic evaluations, which is really what a breed organization is, a cooperative genetic evaluation, as in the case of beef cattle, requires partnerships based on mutual need and mutual benefit. And we'll come back to that as we think about ways to engage other sectors of the beef industry. And I would further submit to you that given the consolidation of what I just say germplasm ownership and consolidation of genetic management decisions is very unlikely in the near term in the beef industry, that a greater degree of participation by individual seed stock producers is required. Now I'm sure I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. It's your colleagues that didn't make the investment in coming to this meeting that probably need that speech. I would further contend that the rate of genetic change in the beef industry is limited due to decreased selection intensity, so we'll go through that in more detail. Increased generation interval. You heard the dramatic decrease in generation interval made in the dairy industry. Beef cattle, it's 4.5, 5 years, 4.5 on the low end, probably 5 to 6 years. Lack of critical phenotypes, incomplete genotyping, and then I would also say the lack of understanding of what I consider fundamental genetic principles. And then finally, something that we deal with is industry segmentation. So I believe those to be the key limiters of increasing the rate of genetic change. So just some, when I was looking through this was meant to be an outline. You're taught in school to always have an outline for your presentations. I rarely do that. And this time I did it and kind of fouled it up because the talk really doesn't go in this order. So this is really just random things Matt wanted to cover today. But it's more of a notes page. But I wanted to go through what I consider kind of fundamental roles and responsibilities of each sector of our industry, what clearly defined goals may look like, the ability to enable commercial level decisions in an easier framework than what we do today. In my anecdotal experience, when commercial producers don't utilize tools like EPDs and indices, it's in part because we gave them too much stuff to sort through, and it created confusion to where they just ignored the good and the bad stuff. The fact that we need to continue what I call informed phenotyping and then also informed genotyping. So clearly defining goals for a seed stock producer, in my mind at least, at a kind kind of 30,000 foot level, this requires identifying target clientele that are likely homogeneous in their breeding goals. So what I mean by that is a group of clientele that have relatively similar objectives. Now, as a seed stock enterprise grows in size, it enables more diversity, okay? The ability to meet different clientele demands. As a seed stock operation begins to become smaller, meeting multiple commercial demands becomes much more challenging. So the overall goal, I would argue, is to increase commercial profit. So the profit of your clientele. For commercial producers, it requires actually identifying the key drivers of profit. So actually having an understanding of unit cost of production, right? Things like that. And understanding that profit is conditioned on marketing goals. And we always say environmental constraints as well. And it's really not so much environmental constraints, because the reality is environmental constraints turn into economic constraints. If I have limited forage, we call that an environmental constraint. It's really not. I can just feed them more. Buy feed and feed them more. That then turns into an economic constraint, right? That's why I don't do it. So really, it's economic constraints. All right, second and last equation of the day. But if you're a seed stock producer, this is really the rubric that you follow. Trying to make genetic progress, change, as quickly as possible. That is your job. So you also have to make decisions simple for commercial clientele, and obviously sell problem-free animals. You're selling a product, you want to sell a product that's as fault-free as possible, to where people don't come back to you and say, it didn't work, it broke, right? This, you guys have seen, this is really the accuracy of EPD, selection intensity, genetic standard deviation, generation interval, and it's all manifest in the amount of genetic change we make per year. So when I sit down with firms, let's call them, so small groups, and we really talk about a genetics program, I refer back to this, to try to identify what I call the leaks in genetic gain. So where are you giving up genetic gain through your standard operating procedures? So potential leaks include reduced accuracy, so reducing this bit because you didn't collect all the phenotypes you should, because you didn't genotype. Okay, those things reduce accuracy. As a question, let's say that I'm cheap, which actually that's not a question, that's a statement, I am. My wife would confirm that. But let's say I'm cheap, and I only want to pay to measure some expensive phenotype on the best animals in my contemporary group. So that worst animals, however I define that, I don't measure them. So everyone in here would probably agree somehow I bias that. But the best animals, how many think I artificially made them better? How many thinks I artificially made them worse? I made them worse, didn't I? I just shot myself in the foot because I was too cheap, too lazy to measure it on everybody. Reduced intensity, right here, so that's related to the proportion of animals that I actually choose to make parents. As that proportion shrinks, becomes smaller, I can make faster change. That's because the animals I selected as parents now are that much more superior compared to the average. So I can actually reduce this, which is a bad thing, if I actually cull genetically superior animals for perceived flaws. So I walk through a pen of bulls, and I say, that one's ugly-headed. That one's got a big tail head. That one, he should be leveler. And those happen to be the highest indexing bulls, but I culled them anyway. I just gave up a bunch in selection intensity. Using older sires and not culling older dams, well, that impacts generation interval. right? There's that 20-year-old sire, for whatever reason, is still my favorite. So I use him, and I also keep my cows around until they just quit having a calf. You know, they're 10, 12 years old, whatever. Talking about seed stock production now. All of a sudden, I dramatically increase generation interval, which decreases the amount or the speed at which I make progress. I was thinking about this in the back of the room, so I hear this from a lot of seed stock producers. I run my cows like my commercial customers run their cows. How many of you would agree with that statement? This isn't a test, right? You can't be right or wrong, right? Several of you. And so part of, I shouldn't tell you why you do that. As I think about it, part of the logic of that is a couple-fold. One, obviously your commercial clientele are trying to reduce unit cost of production, and it would make sense if you try to keep a handle on unit cost of production as well. The other thing is, you want whatever you measure to be as closely related as possible to what they're going to get paid on, right? So what does that do? That has the potential to actually increase accuracy if we assume the trait we really want to improve is the trait measured at the commercial level, and we're just measuring the best indicator at the seed stock level we can, right? Now, if you keep cows around a long time to do that, you're trading accuracy for increased generation. And in beef cattle, this is the primary limitation to speeding up genetic change. All right, the other thing is genotyping animals with records. That really goes to accuracy. And where we struggle in the beef industry today is on the female side. We need more females genotyped, complete cohort groups of females. Because the things we really want genomics to help us with, maternal traits, that's only going to help us if we genotype the ones that have those records, which are the females. I'm sure there's additional potential leaks to genetic gain, but those are more common ones I think of. Now, if you're a commercial producer in the room, you hope your seed stock supplier is thinking about these things. Your job is inherently different, right? You keep cows longer. Why? Presumably, you like to depreciate those cows out, right? Your job is different. So the commercial cow-calf responsibilities, hopefully you choose sires based on their genetic potential to increase net profit. And hopefully you do that considering the return on investment of your bull purchase. And for those of you in here that are cringing, don't worry, I'm not going to throw out a dollar value of what I think a bull should be worth, okay? I'm not near that stupid, right? But I'm not confident that commercial producers really think about a bull selection decision as an economic investment. And that's very much the way it should be thought of. Larger herds should contemplate recording data with a breed organization. Larger commercial herds should contemplate recording data with a breed organization. Why? Because they're going to collect records that may not be collected routinely in a seed stock setting, and those records could be very informative for genetic evaluation. So it really enables more accurate EPD that can be used to perform sire selection. As we go through these different sectors of the industry, here's the deal. Seed stock producers, you realize I collect data, I give it to Steve, and I get back something that's valuable to me, an EPD. So there's mutual benefit. As we engage other sectors of the industry, we want their data. You've got to return something back that they value. That's the only way that exchange works. Fed cattle sector responsibilities, I'd say pay value for value. I didn't coin that phrase. I heard it from somebody who knows a whole lot more about the fed cattle sector than I do. But it's the idea of being able to actually ascertain, based somewhat on genetics, the inherent value of a feeder calf and reward the better ones and discount the worse ones. That's kind of pull through of what you guys do. There are examples where that's beginning, right? But I really think that's what is required. And I would like to think they would understand the value of and participate in genetic evaluation. Fed cattle sector, participate in genetic evaluation. What could you return? Well, if I had a breeding value on feeder calves coming in, or an aggregate breeding value on a pen of fed cattle, might that change my management decisions, given I know something about their genetic potential? That could be an exchange. Oh, and if you guys saw my billings every 2 weeks here for the past several months from the cattle that I own, you probably wouldn't take advice from me on the fed cattle sector. But these are just kind of my thoughts. Use selection indices. As the list of EPD grows, multiple trait selection becomes more complex. I think we also need to consider a reductionist approach. There are EPDs that we've had for a long time because initially it was the best thing we could do. It was the best indicator we had. But we've advanced. You heard birth weight mentioned a couple of times this morning. That would be a candidate one. Do we need that on the list? Particularly as we grow the list even more. Commercial producers, should use the indices that best fit their breeding objective, right? They sell at weaning, retain replacement females, TI is probably not for them. They do have to keep an eye on carcass traits though, because someone's going to feed them. Note that ERT are only realized at the commercial level, be that cow-calf, herds, feedlots, packers, even retailers. And as an industry, I think we need to get a better handle on what are the genetic relationships between what we measure in seed stock herds and what's actually realized as an economic driver downstream. The value of what we collect in seed stock herds is based on the genetic correlation between it and what is actually valued downstream. Right? Classic example, of course, is ultrasound and carcass, but there's others. There are others. So selection index in a nutshell, obviously a tool to inform multiple trait selection based on what your breeding objectives are, certain economic parameters, so the costing of a unit of corn, an example, the value of a pound of carcass weight, the relationships among traits, and the population, right now, the population mean. So what is the average marbling score in fed cattle? Right? As that changes, the relative economic value of another increase in it changes as well. If 100% of cattle graded prime right now, what's the incentive to increase it more? If 100% of the heifers got pregnant, what's the value in another unit increase in genetic potential for heifer pregnancy? Right? And again, this is really important. I'm sure everyone in this room understands it, but it's amazed me how in other breeds, some seed stock producers don't understand that these tools are to drive commercial level profitability. That's different from saying I have a breed directive to improve XYZ trait, right? Just because you have a desire to gain as an organization, maybe competitive advantage in a single trait, doesn't change that trait's weighting in the index. Because the index is designed on commercial level profit. Obviously, this is about a decade, give or take, years old to the beef industry, but really old hat in other industries. As we increase the list of EPDs, we've somehow got to turn those EPDs or tools into decisions, which requires really additional support for commercial producers. How many of you have in here, whatever that was, how many of you have put together a sale catalog? Right? How many of you enjoy that exercise? Dave does. I hate it, right? I do. And maybe part of it's because were you in the bull sales class at K-State, Carrie? No? You rely, I run that class at UNL, you rely on students, you set deadlines, and what happens? A couple nights before it needs to go to the printer, I'm working away at it. That's probably why I hate it. But the flaw with that oftentimes is we put so much stuff in there, so much data, people get confused, right? And they turn away from it, instead of directing them towards the tools that might actually enable them to make informed decisions. So we've got to make our selection simple for commercial clientele, because they've got a lot of stuff going on. They may not think about genetics every day of the year like you guys do. They've got other things to consider, and so it's unreasonable to ask them to stay abreast of all the changes in genetic evaluation. It's really unreasonable. That is your job. That is your task. So a goal, we took a swing at this and we missed, and we took a swing again and we hit. And Warren Snelling, Mark Thalman, Larry Keene at US MARC, Bruce Golden, who's in the back, Bob Weber at Kansas State, and myself received funding through a federal grant to develop what we call web-based decision support. Decision support isn't new, right? There have been tools around before, tried and ended for various reasons. But the idea is to be able to take EPDs and herd level parameters and develop customizable selection indices for commercial clientele to actually use. And so the idea is, in a very small nutshell here, that an individual commercial producer could enter their own economic parameters, maybe herd production parameters, their desired goals, breed composition of the cow herd, etc. We could utilize that to determine what the relative economic value is for a given set of traits that fit their breeding objective, and then pull EPDs either from a list, maybe a sale list that you provide, they're interested in your sale. They could use that customized index then to rank those bulls, or maybe entire breed organizations' list of bulls. And the idea is that there's some value in customizing indexes this way. There's a marginal value, though, compared to the static indexes you have now. I really think the big benefit is commercial producers now participate in it. And because they participate in it, they believe the tool more. So they're engaged in the process, which I think could aid in technology adoption. We just started this. We actually just got awarded this project funding in April, May of this year. It's a 3-year project. But we're kind of excited to keep people abreast as this evolves. I've been told a picture's worth 1,000 words. Back to the sale catalog. Right? A picture's worth 1,000 words. I would contend you really only need 2 words. You don't need 1,000 of them. So back to the reductionist approach of what actually is important for your clientele to sort through. Now, I'm a realist, okay? I don't expect you to just publish 2 indexes on every single animal in your catalog, but what I do encourage you to think about is, what should I point them towards? That's your job, to help point them towards the right decision to make. Other species obviously have access to the same tools. We heard about the dairy industry a little bit ago, and we always use the dairy industry as the poster child for genomic selection. And I'll say this in a very unbiased way. The tools, Dave, be that Simmental or Angus right now, the tools that we use in the beef industry for genomic selection are as advanced, and in some cases more advanced, than any other animal sector. And I believe that. And that's actually supported in the scientific literature. So you guys should be extremely pleased with that. What makes a difference? Other species adopt the tools faster, and they do place selection pressure solely on selection indices. I mentioned before the importance of commercial level data, and it's not an easy thing to capture, but we need to do a better job than we do now. I think that is the evolution that is before us. Not really going to single step we're there. It's now focusing on traits for which we have either ignored because we didn't realize their importance, or more likely ignored because they were too expensive and cumbersome to actually collect. I would contend that the full benefits of genomic selection are only going to be fully realized when we collect the full suite of traits for which genomics could always have been the most impactful. And we've got a ways to go yet in that regard. And as I thought about it more, I might even contend that the improvement in genomic selection methods to date have really just been stepping stones to enable to capture more phenotypes further downstream in our industry, at the packing plant level, at the fed cattle level, etc. I think there's real opportunity there. Options for getting commercial phenotypes, carcass merit program, CMP. Did I get that right? Right, the CMP, more structured kind of sire tests, more expensive, and you get limited numbers of offspring, but there's an advantage though in having some structure to the data. I might also say, and I made this comment on a panel yesterday afternoon, that elite young sires, hopefully we define elite as being exceptional for index value, but elite young sires should be mated to as many or more commercial cows than seed stock cows right off the bat. And then we follow those resulting calves all the way through and collect phenotypes on them and preferably genotype them. Why right off the bat? Because we want to reduce genetic lag. Right? We want to learn as much as we can from his offspring as quickly as we can. So it's about reducing what we call genetic lag. Collecting phenotypes on commercial animals from commercial bulls does provide some benefits, but not as large as this scenario here, because we've increased really the length of time generationally. So we increased the lag time. I would say if collecting these things are already part of the ranch SOP, they feed out all the cattle, they get carcass data, then my goodness, yes, we want to capture that and get it into genetic evaluation. Contemporary grouping. So if you listened to Bruce this morning, and I hope you guys did, you realize that breed effects for all traits except carcass traits are estimated from IGS data. Why? Because there exists connectivity between the breeds, and that is largely driven by contemporary groups that compare individuals head-to-head across different breed fractions. We don't have that in carcass data in IGS right now. So estimates from US MARC are utilized, but as you think about contemporary grouping, having multi-breed contemporary groups would certainly be helpful. Now don't force or fudge contemporary groups to give me what I just asked for. But if the opportunity exists to form those, that would be ideal. And then of course, I'd hope you guys would genotype all animals, even the dead ones. There could be cases where the dead ones are extremely informative. Why did they die? No, it's a good song, Wade. Let it roll. Let it roll, buddy. So we want to use genomics to make selection decisions, not just to obtain a marketing advantage, and hopefully enable genomic selection for sex-limited traits. Great example is female fertility. But to do that, we've got to genotype the females. Currently, the best advice is to genotype all animals. Currently, the best advice I can provide you, simply because the lack of structure in the beef industry makes strategic genotyping or phenotyping more problematic. The strategery, as the former president would say, the strategery involved in phenotyping and genotyping, though, is an area of much needed research. Somebody last night, I don't think that person's here, asked the question, I have X number of dollars a year to invest in the combination of genotyping and phenotyping. How do I make that investment? That's a very good question. And we need to work harder as a research community to actually provide direction in that regard. Relationships. I think it's funny that I'm talking about relationships, but as you think about genomics, it really is all predicated in some form or fashion on relationships. It's really the fundamental thing that ties together and enables genetic evaluation. Historically, that's been pedigree only, right as we think pre-genomics, usually deep pedigrees, somewhat prone to errors with and without malice aforethought. Genomic data, though, now enables deviations between closely related individuals that simply weren't possible before. Nice example is full sieves. We genotype them, we can now parse them more than we were ever able to before. Okay, the full sieves, they could be actually not related at all at the genomic level or akin to being identical twins. Our expectation is they're somewhere in the middle. But DNA testing allows us to parse those and also clean up pedigree errors, which is good for selection, of course, sometimes bad for politics. An example of a pedigree, this is a pedigree, simple pedigree over here, and really the numerical value that represents degree of relationship. If we look at animal 1 and 10, this is grandsire, grand offspring. Our expected value of the relationship is 1/4. That's our expectation. It could range from 0 to 1/2. And what that actual relationship is tells us how informative information from this animal is at predicting the genetic merit of that individual. So if we look at using genomic relatedness, what do you see now? We get estimates of relationship even between individuals we didn't think were related before, because maybe our pedigree wasn't deep enough. And now you can see a deviation from our expected relationship. At the heart of it, that's what's driving changes that you see with the genomic evaluation. And it's important to realize, at least at a 30,000-foot level, what's going on. Pictorial example of grandparents and grand offspring. Our expectations 1/4. This is actually real data, and you can see a fairly normal distribution around that, ranging from about 0 to 1/2, which is theoretically what we always knew it should be. Now we can just quantify it. If you're a commercial producer, how do you really take advantage of genomics? Well, buy bulls from populations that genotype. Buy bulls from populations that have moved to single step. Right? So the benefit is in the information contained in the bull's EPDs, because if you're a self-replacing herd, the majority of change you're going to make is through the bulls that you use. How do we organizationally use genotypes to the fullest? We already correct pedigree errors, but we could also use them to do things like track inbreeding. Selection increases inbreeding, right? That's what it does. People get all nervous about inbreeding. I really don't. And particularly now that we have genomic data, we can see problems coming before they manifest. So we can utilize genomics to do that. Identify and manage, not purge, manage lethal and sublethal haplotypes. You could also use it in the future for things like breed identification and estimating retained heterozygosity. So congratulations to ASA for crossing the finish line, releasing a single-step evaluation. Obviously, because folks like me want to have a job so I can retire, there's going to be improvements made to single step over time, right? It's genetic evaluation. It's never been static. It shouldn't be static. I would say, though, that we need to put more emphasis into the phenotyping side and actually helping clientele enable more accurate selection decisions. I think I said this the first time in 2016, and I used a different word than messing up. But in the fall of 16, right, you could say anything and it was all right. But the single thing that stood out to me the most in the genomic selection era is the majority of beef seed stock producers never really understood EPD and accuracy to begin with, present company excluded. At some point, I fear this will manifest itself and will mess up the end game. Right? So your colleagues that aren't here need to understand these tools equally as well. I would also say that it gives us an opportunity to think about organizational focus on what we really are in terms of breed organizations. What are our core missions? And if it is genetic-centric, then we need to make sure that that is indeed the core mission. So what's the future hold? I would say more on strategic phenotyping at the nucleus level, getting more phenotypes at the commercial level or outside of seed stock herds, and perhaps predicting breeding values, so twice an EPD, for commercial animals, including fed cattle, that can be used to market and manage those animals. So allowing genetics to flow through the breeding pyramid. And there might also be a clear delineation between genetic decision makers and cattle producers. Right now, seed stock production is the two rolled together, right? You manage a seed stock herd and you make genetic decisions. There is nothing magical that says it's the same person that does both those. Nothing magical about that at all. Changes to genetic evaluation. How can you be most helpful? Be an active participant in it. Genotype animals, submit phenotypes. Be a steward of the data. Do the best job you can at collecting those things. And be an advocate for change. Right? Nobody's an advocate for their bull getting worse, okay? But change isn't always bad. It means we do a better job of what we're supposed to be doing. Become a student or a lifelong learner in terms of genetics and understand that your profit should be directly tied to your commercial producers or your clientele's profit. And I'd also say continue to challenge us and help us identify emerging needs. That has to come from you guys. What are the next frontiers that are needed for the cattle industry? That really needs to come from you guys. You also have to be the educators for the commercial industry. And I know some of you, and that scares the hell out of me to say that. But here's the reality. So this is a group of extension specialists, colleagues and friends of mine that have or had a partial extension appointment in the area of beef cattle genetics. This is Dare Bullock from the University of Kentucky, Jared Decker from the University of Missouri. Megan Rolfe, when this picture was taken, was at Oklahoma State. She's now at Kansas State and actually doesn't have an extension appointment. Allison Van Eningham from UC Davis, Bob Weber from Kansas State, and this sexy young man here is yours truly. That's not very many people, right? There's absolutely no way that team educates the masses. Now, we've tried with web-based resources, etc. But you guys got to help carry the water. You really do. So, just another thing on strategic uses of resources going forward in the future. What I could envision at the nucleus, if we clearly delineated those, is we genotype and we get cheap and easy indicators. At the multiplier level, we genotype and maybe collect phenotypes on hopefully the commercial or the crossbred females there in the multiplier. And then at the commercial level, we do cheap genotyping and phenotyping, both perhaps enabled by DNA pooling. That's an idea for what the future may hold in terms of organizational structure of a genetic evaluation. Out of curiosity, how many of you would identify yourself as a multiplier? Kind of disagree with that one, but how many of you would identify yourself as a nucleus breeder? Right. That's an awkward question, isn't it? I ask that in most audiences, say, who's a nucleus breeder? Yeah, you're damn right I am. The reality is there's far fewer up here. And that's the way it actually should work. But clearly delineating those, I actually think enables more informed use of the data we turn in. All right, a couple of helpful websites. So by state law, in Nebraska, I have to show this one, the UNL beef production website. And then that group of extension colleagues I showed you, we put together ebeef.org. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at that and provide constructive feedback, if you will. With that, again, I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I welcome any questions.
Oh, I know better than that. If you have a question, I would love to bring this microphone.
And I'm going to be around too, so you can grab me if you can find me.
No one at all. Look what you do. You intimidate the masses.
Well, it's about 6 minutes till drinking time. So my guess is these folks have better things to do.
Matt, I'll ask a question if no one else will. One of the things that we've been talking about among the staff and among the board is we've got a commercial option in our total herd enrollment called Option D. It costs $500 a year, and that includes a membership to the ASA, and you can submit all the phenotypes that you're collecting for these commercial herds. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is trying to encourage more and more breeders to use that with some of their kind of elite commercial clientele to try and help them prove their own genetics. And so I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on it, kind of a strategy along those lines.
So I very much like the idea of having a commercial option, so at least allowing a gateway in for commercial level data. I mean, I think that's a starting place. You know, where those things really break down is, if I'm a commercial producer, obviously I made a conscious decision that I don't want to have to collect the amount of data you guys collect. I don't want to have to spend as much money, as much time doing it as you guys do. I made that decision. So if I'm going to do it, what do you give me in return that I can't live without? That's the trick. That's the trick. Now, I could envision things, so that data could be used to make management decisions if you can provide some simple reports for me. Maybe actually having EPDs or breeding values on replacement females is beneficial to me. But this system works when there's mutual benefit. Right? You just asked me to do it for the greater good. I think I'm a good person, but I don't know if I'm that good. Dave.
One second, Dave, so they can hear you. This is going to be profound, so we need them to know.
You're a dreamer. If I was going to, as a multiplier of bulls for commercial men, what would be the minimum amount of ERTs would you put in your catalog? Minimum or maximum, and what would they be?
Yeah, I think Cadmium's direct, Cadmium's maternal would be in there. You know, depending on how they market calves would dictate what weight traits might go in there. Something like marbling and carcass weight for carcass traits, and then a couple of indexes. I put maternal milk in there as well. But if I had a clearly identified group, though, Dave, where I said they're all terminal, then I can shrink that list even more. Or they're all maternal, I can shrink it even more.
I get voted down by my partners, especially my wife, who's I'm sleeping with a bookkeeper, and she writes out the checks. But really, Cadmium is correct. Half a pregnancy, dollars weaning, terminal index, dollars beef. Now, I will take issue with you or anyone else that thinks that a person that sells their calves at weaning should pick different bulls than people that are going to feed them out themselves. Because somebody's going to eat them and somebody's going to buy them. And I think with these value-added things, Angus, Lincoln, what we're doing here in Simmentals, that's going to be a valuable thing for commercial people to have, so that people that are bidding on their calves in the future are going to have, the buyers are going to have an idea for those things. But I want to know what you would put in, which would be far more than that.
Yeah, so those are obviously Angus metrics, but I don't think our lists are that different, Dave. I might say that something that's reproductive longevity oriented, stability, might be more important than heifer pregnancy because the open heifers still have quite a bit of value. The open older females are the ones that really hurt. But I think we're on the same page there. To your other comment, which you and I visited about before, and that's really the reason why I mentioned that even if you sell at weaning, you can't ignore carcass traits because they're going to be fed. If we could, and there are examples, but industry-wide, if there could truly be sharing of that value throughout, then I agree more and more with exactly what you said. When there's disconnect, that individual enterprise that still sells at weaning has to stay viable, even though they still have to recognize, for the industry's sake, and someday their own benefit, carcass merit has to be good enough. But that enterprise still has to stay viable.
I think personally that heifer pregnancy and calving infidelity for heifers and so on, it ought to be reflected in the dollars weaning, which in the Angus data, none of that's in it. The only thing that's in that in Angus data is a formula they use to predict mature size, metabolic size based on yearling weight, which is, in my opinion, like putting a 13 horsepower motor in a Corvette. But I think of those ERTs, we should have maybe fewer of them and have them include more things. I just can't imagine why a fertility trait and a stability trait shouldn't play a major role in dollars weaning.
I completely agree, and I think this room would agree too that API is a superior tool over $W. And I think rationally, as you look at it, it is. It's more.
But that takes into account everything, API.
Correct, but weighted. Yep. But you're right.
I'm with you. I just.
Yep. But I think that's right. The economic indexes have to fit the breeding objective. And if the breeding objective is to retain replacement heifers where no doubt sustained cow fertility is the #1 economic driver and it's missing, it's hard to say that tool's as helpful as it should be.
It may not be with genomics. It may not be with genomics if you believe what we saw today about in the dairy business.
So I think part of the benefit of genomics, quite frankly, is we increase the accuracy of EPDs, which inherently has the potential to increase the accuracy of the index. Then.
Amen.
Yep.
Amen, no doubt.
Mr. Butcher, this is yours.
Do you have any comments on, we're really in this business chasing better and more specifically, more and better carcass value traits. And I read a deal not too long ago that said that the genetics business is outrunning the commercial management that's associated with the genetics we sell. What do you maybe have seen that, but
I haven't. On the carcass side, I don't know. I will say there's certainly a disconnect between consumers and what we select for. Tenderness is a great example there.
no, I'm talking about commercial producers versus the seed stock, the high-end seed stock that we're selling people. They don't have the management. They aren't willing to, just as an example, the cow size has gone up big time in the last 10 or 15 years, and the weaning weight improvement has not kept up. We've made the cattle a lot better on the carcass basis, but most of the cattle aren't retained, so the feedlots get all the goodies. And this is all, we're trying to all be competitive, And it just seems like at the commercial level, you know, at least this is what this thing said, that I just comment on that.
No, I know where you're headed. So actually, instead of carcass, where I really think about how we've and you hit on it, how maybe we've outpaced what commercial environments can withstand, are things like mature cow weight, in some breeds in particular, maternal weaning weight or milk, where genetic trend is actually in the opposite direction of what is needed to improve profit at the commercial level, in part because those production environments simply aren't rich enough to let the genetics express itself. So I would agree with that. Relative to feed yards getting all the goody when, you know, commercial producers let their calves go beforehand, I think that goes to some of Dave's comments, and that, you know, more and more it would be good to see some of that value sent back upstream to the commercial producer. And in my pipe dream vision, genomics actually can help enable that if we can begin to tie phenotypes at that level all the way back through the system. The other thing I'd say that's really easy for me to say, how do you make sure you get all the goodie out of the genetic investment you made? Own them all the way through. Now, some people are too adverse to risk, right, to do that, and I understand it. But if you've been selecting high TI or high dollar beef bulls, Dave, for years, and you sell your calves at weaning, why?
But that's just my point. The breed associations and our #1 competitor, for an example, that Dave's on the board of.
But Dave, he's not going to mention any names.
No, but a classic example is they're supposed to be a maternal breed. And I had some friends that had just visited Origin that come up to visit, and they had which barn, which bull, and they had the barn, the name of the bull, and the dollar's beef. That was what was on the sheet.
So that, and I know, what's the quote, Lauren and Bruce, you're cutting in on my drinking time, but to that point, so the delineation of a maternal or terminal breed is more than what's, you know, publicized in trade magazines or printed on a website. The data tells us where they fit. The data tells us where a breed fits. The other thing I'd say, if a commercial producer says, man, the genetic trend for mature weight doesn't fit me, what would be nice is to say, I'm going to source replacement females from somebody that breeds for fertility, decreased mature size, decreased lactation potential. Then I'm going to go buy high-octane bulls as terminal sires, because I only got to feed a few of those. I got to feed a bunch of cows. So the clear delineation between terminal and maternal, our industries never grabbed a hold of. But other industries have made it work beautifully.
That bull would be a different breed than those cows.
Yeah, well, not only will he be because of the way we see genetic trends go, but he should be. Because and moreover, Dave, there should be not purebred cows in that system for the commercial guy. They should be composites.
On the maternal side.
Yeah, the maternal cows as a commercial producer that I source, which would be beautiful if I could buy them not as young heifers, but if I bought them coming with a second calf, which is oftentimes at a discount, though, but actually more expensive for somebody to make. Then I don't have to worry about calving heifers. I'm going to have bigger calves. That system has a lot of advantages to efficiency. A lot of advantages. And I think gets at some of the things that you mentioned, because now all of a sudden I've got two kinds of cattle that I can make fit the environment.
I'm coming, Carrie. Carrie, give me the phone.
Carrie's a former K-Stater.
So this is going to be super wise.
Well, I have to agree a lot with what you're saying, Matt, but
but I've had a lot of conversations with very prominent breeders of different breeds that feel like they have the genetics that will do all things in all scenarios for everyone. And it's just not true. I mean, and what you said to me makes perfect sense that, you know, the commercial cattleman probably needs a hybrid female, not a straight bred female. She needs to be bred to perform in her environment and be smaller size, lower input, more maternally focused, and then go buy an Angus bull to put on top of.
Yeah, so why hasn't that happened? Well, the majority of cow herds in the U.S., the majority of feeder cattle come out of cow herds that are extremely small, where that enterprise is not the primary driver of household income. And so the incentive sometimes to do things off the beaten path maybe is less. But that doesn't mean, if you look at some of the largest commercial ranches in the U.S., what do most of them have in common? They run crossbred cows, don't they? And a lot of them, not all, a lot of them retain ownership on everything all the way through because they want to get all the goodie out.
They also make the distinction between low input cows and big cows. Because you can have small, heavy milking cows. I don't like the term of just going on the frame size.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, mature size of cows versus input of cows. And so obviously mature size is a driver of feed intake, because if you're bigger, you tend to eat more. But there's also the lactation bit. And not just when the cow is lactating, even when she's dry. If she has the genetic potential to milk more, she needs more for maintenance. So it's those two things together, and the reality is mature size is fairly easy to see. You drive by the cows, you can see it. Milk is oftentimes hidden, and you don't see it until you're in a harsh environment and young females come up open. Yeah. So again, I don't know what topic I was actually given to speak about, and I'm confident that we covered things that weren't on it. But I've honestly enjoyed it. And I remember one of the first presentations I gave after I was hired at UNL, not one of the first, but it was early in the years, maybe when we started the Weight Trait Project. We had a first meeting at Clay Center, and John introduced me. And some of you, have been engaged in those meetings. And John said to the group, producers like you, Dave, that he's known for a long time, and said, this guy's young, teaching. And at the time I thought, I've got a Ph.D. I'm here to impart wisdom upon you. My goodness, how profound that was, though, because I've probably learned more from folks like you than I've ever given back. So I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
So again, you know that each person who spoke today gets these. But to me, the interesting piece throughout the day, Wade, is for the most part, some are visitors from the outside. But the folks who are getting these have been crucial to building this book. And that's the cool part. And yeah, he's dapper and damn good looking and young, but he had a big part to the last few chapters of this book, and the next few chapters we'll write. One more time to Dr. Spangler. Give him a hand.